The wind that tore through the Laramie Basin in the winter of 1868 did not blow. It shrieked. It was a living, hateful thing, armed with teeth of ice that gnawed through wool and leather alike, seeking the marrow of anyone foolish enough to be out in the white void. Clara could no longer feel her feet. She had ceased to feel them 3 miles back, somewhere near the skeletal remains of a cottonwood tree that marked the edge of the territory God seemed to have abandoned. Her boots were thin, cheap leather purchased in a hurry in a railhead town in Nebraska, and they were packed with snow that had melted and refrozen into harsh blocks of ice against her skin. She stumbled, her knees hitting the crust of the snow with a thud that jarred her teeth, but her arms did not drop. Her arms were locked in a rigid, desperate cradle against her chest. The bundle she carried was wrapped in a woolen shawl, then a man's flannel shirt, and finally, the tatters of her own coat. Inside the bundle, the child was silent. He had been crying for 2 days, a thin mewling sound that grated on her nerves like a saw against bone. But now he was quiet. The silence was worse. The silence terrified her more than the men who might be tracking her, more than the wolves she had heard howling the night before. "Just a little further," she whispered, though her lips were too numb to form the shapes of the words properly. The sound came out as a dry rasp. "Just to the ridge." There was no ridge. There was only the endless, blinding white of the Wyoming sagebrush flat, buried under 3 feet of drift. She stood up, swaying like a drunkard. Hunger was a dull ache in her belly, a hollow pit that had long since stopped growling and simply settled into a cramping emptiness. She had not eaten a full meal since leaving Kansas. She took another step. The wind shoved her hard, nearly toppling her sideways. She corrected her balance, clutching the bundle tighter. A flash of memory assaulted her, the smell of coal oil and burning hay, the heat of the flames licking up the side of a barn, the shouting of men. "Get him out!" a voice in her head screamed. "Run, girl! If they catch you, you hang!" She shook her head to clear the vision. The cold was a mercy in that regard. It dulled the sharp edges of her terror. Ahead, through the swirling curtain of snow, a shape materialized. It was rigid, angular, and dark against the gray sky. A roofline? A chimney? Smoke! The sight of the thin wisp of gray smoke rising against the gale broke something inside her. The adrenaline that had fueled her for 100 miles evaporated, leaving only the crushing weight of exhaustion. She tried to run, but her legs were like lead weights. She managed 3 more stumbling strides before the ground seemed to tilt upward and strike her in the face. The snow was soft, at least soft and cold and welcoming. She curled around the bundle, shielding it with her own body, and closed her eyes. The wind howled over her, sounding like a choir of the damned. But for the first time in weeks, she felt warm. Elias McCrae was not a man who enjoyed company. He had chosen this shack on the banks of the Little Laramie River precisely because the road to get there was treacherous, and the land yielded nothing but rocks and wind-twisted sage. He had spent 4 years fighting a war he didn't believe in, scouting for the Confederacy through the muddy hells of Tennessee and Virginia. And when the surrender came, he had ridden west until the silence in his head matched the silence of the land. He was checking his trap line along the ravine when he saw the dark mound in the snow. At first, he thought it was a calf that had wandered off from one of the big outfits down south, frozen stiff. He almost turned back. A dead calf was coyote bait. Nothing more, but the shape was wrong. He adjusted the brim of his hat against the wind and trudged closer, his boots crunching loudly in the drifts. He carried a Henry rifle in the crook of his arm, a habit that died hard. When he reached the mound, he prodded it gently with the toe of his boot. It groaned. Elias dropped to one knee, brushing away the drift that had already begun to bury the figure. A woman. He saw a tangled mass of dark hair, matted with ice, and a face so pale it looked like porcelain cracked by the cold. "Hell's fire," Elias muttered, his voice rough from disuse. He rolled her over. She was light, dangerously so. Nothing but bird bones and rags. Her arms were locked tight around a bundle. He tried to pry them apart, but her grip was iron. Even unconscious, she was fighting to keep it. He didn't waste time checking for a pulse. If she wasn't dead yet, she would be in 10 minutes if he left her here. He scooped her up, bundle and all. She weighed less than a sack of grain. He turned and marched back toward the shack, his head ducked against the biting wind, moving with the steady, ground-eating stride of a man used to walking through hell. The shack was small, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and straw. Inside, it was dark, smelling of cured tobacco, wood smoke, and old coffee. Elias kicked the door shut behind him and laid the woman on his narrow bunk. He stoked the cast-iron stove until the belly of it glowed cherry red. Then he turned his attention to the woman. He had to get the wet clothes off her, or the chill would kill her as surely as a bullet. He worked quickly, his large, scarred hands surprisingly gentle as he unbuttoned the sodden coat. When he tried to take the bundle, she whimpered, her eyes flying open. They were blue, shockingly bright, and wide with panic. "No," she croaked. Don't take." "I ain't taking nothing," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "But you're freezing to death, lady. Let go." She fought him weakly, but she had no strength. Elias peeled her fingers away and lifted the bundle. He unwrapped the layers of wool and flannel. A baby. A boy. By the look of him, no more than a few months old. The child was blue-lipped and silent, his skin cold to the touch. Elias swore softly. He placed the baby on the sheepskin rug near the stove, then turned back to the woman. "I gotta get these wet rags off you." She didn't protest this time. She had slipped back into the dark. Elias stripped her down to her shift, piled every blanket he owned on top of her, and then turned his attention to the child. He warmed a bit of goat's milk in a tin cup on the stove, dipped a rag into it, and pressed it to the baby's lips. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then, a small, sputtering cough. The baby's mouth opened, instinctively searching. "That's it," Elias whispered. "Drink up, little badger." Outside, the storm raged, burying the world in white. Inside, Elias McCrae sat in his rocking chair, a stranger's child in one arm and a stranger dying in his bed, wondering just what kind of trouble he had dragged in from the snow. It took 3 days for the fever to break. For 3 days. Clara tossed on the narrow bunk, crying out in her sleep, thrashing against unseen attackers. She spoke of fire. She spoke of a man named Brantley. She begged for mercy. And then, in sudden shifts of tone, she threatened murder. Elias listened. He sat by the stove, mending a bridle, and listened to the disjointed confession of a woman running for her life. He changed the cool clothes on her forehead and dripped broth between her cracked lips. He fed the baby, who had proven to be a survivor, wailing loudly whenever his belly was empty. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind died down. The silence that followed was heavy. Clara opened her eyes. The room was unfamiliar. The ceiling was low and dark, stained with soot. She turned her head, pain spiking through her neck. A man was sitting by the stove, his back to her. He wore a gray flannel shirt and suspenders. His hair was dark, streaked with gray, and hung to his collar. He was whittling a piece of firewood with a knife that looked sharp enough to shave with. "Where is he?" Clara whispered. The man stopped whittling. He didn't turn around immediately. "Baby's in the crate," he said. "Fed and sleeping. Clara tried to sit up, but the room spun." She collapsed back onto the pillow. "Who are you?" "Elias McCrae. This is my shack. You were about a mile out, frozen stiff." "The baby?" "I told you, he's sleeping." Elias finally turned. His face was a map of hard living. A jagged scar ran from his left cheekbone down to his jaw, pulling his expression into a permanent, slight grimace. His eyes were dark, unreadable, set deep beneath heavy brows. "You got a name?" "Clara." "Clara what?" She hesitated. The lie came naturally now, a reflex honed by fear. "Clara Smith?" Elias snorted. He stood up and poured coffee into a tin cup. Walking over to the bunk, he held it out to her. "Drink this. It's strong enough to float a horseshoe." She took the cup with trembling hands. The heat seeped into her fingers, painful and welcome. Thank you. You're running from something. Clara Smith. It wasn't a question. She stiffened. I got lost. The stage. The wagon broke down. No wagon tracks out there. Just your footprints walking away from nothing toward nowhere. Elias leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. And you were talking in your fever. Mentioned a fire. Mentioned a Brantley. Clara's face went ashen. The cup rattled against her teeth as she took a sip. I don't know what you mean. Right, Elias said dryly. He looked over at the crate where the baby slept. Fine-looking boy. Looks like you. He's not mine, she said. The words tumbled out too fast, too sharp. Elias raised an eyebrow. Not yours. You carried him through a blizzard. Nearly died for him. But he ain't yours. No, Clara insisted, her voice rising in panic. I'm a wet nurse. I was taking him to his kin, his real kin, up north. Up north is Montana. That's a long walk. I have to get him there. They'll pay you if you help me. Elias studied her. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way her hands shook not just from cold but from adrenaline. He saw the bruises on her wrists, dark purple marks that looked like fingerprints. He knew a lie when he heard one. He had told enough of them himself, but he also knew that pushing a frightened animal only made it bite. I don't want money, Elias said quietly. And you ain't going anywhere. The pass is snowed in. Be weeks before a horse can get through, let alone a woman on foot. I can't stay here, she whispered. It's not safe. Safe as anywhere else, Elias said. He walked back to the stove and sat down. You can stay till the thaw. Then you and the boy can go wherever you please. But until then, you earn your keep. I ain't running a charity. Clara stared at him, assessing the threat. He was big, scared, and armed, but he had pulled her out of the snow. He had fed the child. And in his eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Not pity, but a weary sort of indifference that felt safer than interest. Okay, she said softly. Okay. The winter settled in with a vengeance. For 6 weeks, the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. There was only the wind, the snow piling up against the logs, and the small, smoky universe of the shack. It was an awkward, stifled existence. They moved around each other like two ghosts, haunting the same hallway. Elias slept on a bedroll near the door, giving Clara the bunk. They spoke little. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional cooing of the baby. Clara refused to name the child. When Elias asked, she simply looked away and said, It isn't my place. His kin will name him. So Elias named him? Pass me little Buck, Elias would say, reaching out his hands while Clara tried to cook stew from dried venison and potatoes. Don't call him that, Clara would snap, though the bite had gone out of her voice. Got to call him something. He kicks like a young buck. Elias found himself watching the boy. He had never been around children. He had no wife, no kin of his own. He had spent his life killing men or moving cows, neither of which required much tenderness. But there was something about the boy, the way his small hand curled around Elias's thumb, the way he watched the firelight with wide, dark eyes, that woke up a part of Elias he thought had died at Shiloh. One evening, a particularly brutal storm hammered the roof, shaking the heavy timbers. The baby was fussy, crying with a high, thin wail that wouldn't stop. Clara paced the floor, bouncing him, her face gray with exhaustion. Here, Elias said, standing up. Give him here. I have him, Clara muttered, swaying on her feet. You're about to drop him. Give him here. Elias took the bundle gently. He nestled the baby into the crook of his arm, holding him against his chest. He began to hum, a low, tuneless vibration deep in his throat. It was an old cavalry marching song, slowed down to a lullaby. The baby quieted, listening to the rumble of the man's voice. Within minutes, he was asleep. Clara watched them, leaning against the table. The firelight cast shadows across her face, highlighting the hollows of her cheeks. She looked at Elias with an expression he couldn't read, fear, gratitude, and a terrible, aching sadness. You're good with him, she said softly. Livestock is livestock. Elias grunted, staring at the baby's sleeping face. Just gotta keep him calm. He likes you. He likes that I'm warm. Elias looked up, catching her eye. Why won't you claim him? Clara, a blind man can see he's yours. Clara turned away, staring into the dark corner of the room. A flash of memory hit her. The smell of whiskey. The heavy hand clamping over her mouth. The tearing of her dress in the tack room. The shame. The branding iron of the town's judgment. Fallen woman. Whore. Thief. He's not mine, she said, her voice shaking. He belongs to a better life than me. Elias didn't press her. He just rocked the boy, little Buck, and watched the fire die down, to pass the time, and to keep the cabin fever from driving them mad. They began to trade skills. It started out of necessity. Elias needed wood split, and his shoulder, carrying an old bullet wound, ached in the cold. Have you ever swung an axe? He asked one morning. I grew up on a farm before, Clara said. Come on then. He took her out to the wood pile. The air was crisp enough to freeze breath in the throat. He showed her how to hold the heavy splitting maul, how to let the weight of the head do the work, and how to read the grain of the wood. She was weak at first, her swings clumsy, but she had a grit to her. She swung with a frustration that seemed to be aimed at something other than the wood. She swung until her hands blistered and bled, refusing to stop until the pile was high. Good, Elias said, nodding his approval. You got a good swing. In return, she found him staring at an old newspaper he had used for insulation in the walls. He was tracing the letters with his finger, his brow furrowed. Can you read? She asked. Elias scowled. I can read signs. I can read a brand. I can read a map. But can you read words? Never had much use for it. Clara went to her bag, the small, battered satchel she had saved from the snow. From the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, she pulled out a book. It was a collection of poetry, the cover worn and stained. Sit, she commanded. Elias sat. She opened the book and pointed to the first line. The boy stood on the burning deck, she read slowly, guiding his finger. It was agonizing work. Elias felt like a fool, stumbling over simple sounds, but Clara was patient. She sat close to him, the smell of her, faintly like soap and wood smoke, filling his head. Her voice was soft, correcting him without mockery. Why do you have this? Elias asked one night, tapping the book. If you were running for your life, why bring a book of poems? Clara touched the page gently, because it was the only thing in that house that was beautiful, and the only thing that was truly mine. Elias looked at her, really looked at her. In the dim light, the bruises on her face had faded, leaving behind a pale, haunting beauty. He saw the strength in her jaw, the sadness in her mouth. He felt a dangerous warmth bloom in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. He tamped it down instantly. Read it again, he said gruffly. I missed that last word. The breaking point came in late February. The wind had been howling for 3 days straight, a relentless, shrieking banshee that rattled the door on its hinges. The firewood was running low. The flour was almost gone. Clara was pacing. She felt like a trapped animal. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every creak of the logs sounded like a boot on the porch. The fear that had been dormant, buried under the routine of survival, clawed its way up her throat. She dropped a tin plate. It clattered loudly on the floor. Clara gasped and fell to her knees, scrambling to pick it up. Her hands shaking so hard she couldn't grasp the metal. She started to sob, ugly, gasping sobs that tore from her chest. Elias was there in 2 strides. He knelt beside her. Clara, it's just a plate. It's not just a plate, she screamed, shrinking away from him. They're coming! Don't you hear them? They're coming to take him! They're going to hang me! She was hysterical, her eyes rolling back, her breath coming in short, sharp hyperventilations. She was back in Kansas. She was back in the barn. Elias didn't think. He reached out and grabbed her shoulders, pulling her up. She fought him, striking at his chest, her fists ineffective against his coat. "Clara, stop!" he barked. He pulled her into him, wrapping his arms around her, pinning her arms to her sides. He didn't kiss her. He didn't try to hush her. He just held her. He became a solid, immovable wall against the storm of her terror. She shook against him, trembling so violently her teeth chattered. She wept into his flannel shirt, soaking the fabric. Elias stood there, feeling the fragile bird bones of her spine under his hands, smelling the terror on her skin. He held her until the sobbing subsided into hiccups. He held her until the trembling stopped. He held her long past the point of propriety. But he couldn't let go. He felt an overwhelming, fierce protectiveness surge through him, a desire to stand between this broken woman and the whole damn world with his rifle and his fists. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face streaked with tears. She looked young and old all at once. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Elias didn't let go of her arms. "You ain't got nothing to be sorry for." She looked over at the crate where little Buck was sleeping, oblivious to the storm inside and out. "He's not mine," she whispered again, the lie slipping out like a prayer, like a shield. "I swear. Elias, he's not mine." It was the lie that kept her safe. If he wasn't hers, she wouldn't have stolen him. If he wasn't hers, the Brantleys couldn't kill her for taking their blood. If he wasn't hers, she didn't have to love him so much it hurt. Elias looked at the boy, then back at Clara. He saw the truth in her eyes, the terrified, desperate love she was trying to deny. He understood why she lied. He understood the weight of sins that weren't her own. He moved his hand from her arm to her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. His skin was rough, calloused like old leather, but his touch was feather-light. "Well," Elias said, his voice low and steady, sealing his fate with 5 simple words. "He's mine now." Clara stared at him, her breath hitching. In the dim, flickering light of the fire, a pact was made, not in blood, but in the shared silence of 2 people who had nowhere else to go. Elias released her and walked to the crate. He looked down at the sleeping child, the boy he had named, the boy he had fed, the boy who now had a father, whether the law allowed it or not. Outside, the wind finally began to die. The spring of 1869 did not arrive with a gentle unfolding of flowers. It arrived with the violence of a breaking dam. The snow that had buried the Laramie Basin for 5 months turned into a torrent of gray slush, swelling the river until it roared like a suffering beast against the banks. The earth turned to gumbo mud, thick and sucking, the kind that could pull a boot right off a man's foot or snap a horse's leg if he wasn't careful. Clara fought the mud just as she had fought the snow. She was thinner now, the softness of her previous life stripped away by the harsh winter, replaced by a wiry, tensile strength. Her hands, once smooth, were chapped and stained with soil. She stood in the small patch of bottomland Elias had cleared near the river, driving a hoe into the heavy earth. Elias watched her from the porch, a mug of bitter coffee steaming in his hand. She worked with a rhythm that was almost angry. Chop, pull, step, chop, pull, step. She was planting corn, dropping the kernels into the furrows with a precision that spoke of determination rather than hope. They had survived the winter. That fact alone sat between them like a heavy stone. They had shared the small space of the cabin, breathing the same stale air, hearing the intimacy of each other's sleep. Yet they remained strangers in the daylight. Clara never spoke of Kansas. She never spoke of the fire she had raved about in her fever. She never spoke of the father of the boy who sat on a blanket at the edge of the field, gumming on a piece of dried leather. Elias finished his coffee and walked down to the fence line. The winter drifts had crushed 3 sections of the rail fence, and the posts were leaning drunkenly toward the river. "The ground's too wet to set posts," Elias said, coming up beside her. Clara didn't look up. She kept hoeing. "Ground doesn't care if we're hungry come winter. Corn needs to go in." "I'm riding out tomorrow," he said. That made her stop. She rested the handle of the hoe against her shoulder and looked at him. Her eyes were the color of the river water. gray and turbulent. Riding where? The double bar outfit needs men to ride the North Line. Fence checking, stray gathering. It pays $20 a month. You're leaving. It wasn't a question. The fear flitted across her face, quick as a shadow, before she locked it away. We need flour. Clara, we need powder and lead. And the boy needs clothes that aren't made of my old shirts. Elias looked toward the horizon, avoiding her gaze. I'll be gone in 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. You got the rifle. You know how to use it. I know how to use it, she repeated. Her voice was flat. Keep the door barred at night. Don't open it for anyone unless you know their voice. I know, she snapped, turning back to the earth. Go. We don't need you watching over us every second. But they did, and they both knew it. The silence of the cabin was deafening without him. For the first 3 days, Clara moved through the chores like a woman in a trance. She fed little Buck, she hoed the corn, she chopped wood until her shoulders burned. At night, she sat by the door with the Henry rifle across her lap, listening to the coyotes yip and howl in the dark. Every creak of the settling logs sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind sounded like a hand trying the latch. She realized then how much Elias's solid, silent presence had become her anchor. Without him, the vastness of the territory felt like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. On the 4th day, she needed supplies. The salt jar was empty, and the baby needed warmth more than the thin blankets provided. She harnessed the old mule to the cart Elias had cobbled together and made the long, slow trek into town. The settlement was little more than a scar on the land. A general store, a blacksmith, a saloon that smelled of stale beer and urine, and a handful of shacks. As Clara guided the mule down the muddy main street, she felt the eyes on her. Men lounging on the porch of the saloon stopped talking. Women walking with baskets on their arms crossed the street to avoid her. She kept her head high, looking straight ahead, the brim of her bonnet shielding her face. But she heard them. The wind carried their whispers like poison darts. That's her, a woman hissed. The one living out at McCrae's place. Ain't no ring on that finger. A man laughed, a low, ugly sound. Just a whore in her bastard. McCrae always was a strange one. Guess he got lonely enough to pick up trash. Clara's hands tightened on the reins until her knuckles turned white. She pulled the cart up to the general store, tied the mule, and went inside with little Buck strapped to her chest. She bought the salt. She bought a yard of flannel. She didn't look at the shopkeeper, and he didn't look at her. Just took her coin and slid the goods across the counter with a sneer. You tell Elias he owes me for that last sack of grain, the shopkeeper muttered. And tell him decent folk don't appreciate the company he keeps. Clara froze. She looked up, meeting the man's watery eyes. Elias McCrae is twice the man you are, she said, her voice trembling with a rage she couldn't suppress. And he pays his debts. She turned and walked out, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully, a stark contrast to the cold knot of shame in her stomach. She drove the mule hard on the way back, tears stinging her eyes, hot and angry. She wasn't crying for herself. She was crying for the baby against her chest, who was guilty of nothing but being born. Elias returned 5 days later. The sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the sagebrush. He was tired, saddle-sore, and smelling of wet horse and cattle, but there was a lightness in his chest as the cabin came into view. He had $20 in his pocket and a bag of peppermint sticks for Clara. The cabin was dark. No smoke rose from the chimney. The lightness in his chest vanished, replaced by a cold dread. He spurred his horse, galloping the last 100 yards. He hit the ground before the horse had fully stopped, his rifle in his hand. Clara, he shouted. He kicked the door open. The inside was in shambles. The table was overturned. The crock of flour had been smashed, dusting the floor in white. In the corner, huddled behind the wood stove, Clara sat with the rifle aimed at the door. When she saw him, the barrel wavered, then dropped. She didn't move. Elias crossed the room in 2 strides. He dropped to his knees beside her. Clara, are you hurt? Where's the boy? He's asleep, she whispered. Her voice was thick. Wrong. Elias reached out and tilted her face toward the fading light coming through the door. He sucked in a breath through his teeth. Her left eye was swollen shut, purple and angry. Her lip was split, a dark line of dried blood running down her chin. There was a bruise blossoming on her cheekbone in the shape of a fist. "Who?" Elias asked. The word came out as a growl, vibrating deep in his chest. Clara pulled away, turning her face to the wall. "Nobody, just a drifter. He wanted food." "A drifter doesn't do this for food," Elias said. He stood up, his hands curling into fists so tight the tendons creaked. "He took the flour, the money. He took what he could find. I fought him off." Elias looked at the overturned table. He looked at the bruises on her arms. "You fought him. Did he touch you? Clara, look at me. Did he force you?" "No," she said quickly. Too quickly. "No, I got the rifle. I fired a shot, and he ran." "Who was it?" "I told you. I don't know." She looked up at him then, and the fear in her one good eye stopped him cold. It wasn't fear of the man who had beaten her. It was fear of Elias, fear of what he would do. "It was someone from town," Elias said, his voice deadly calm. "I saw the tracks outside. Shod horse, one shoe loose on the near hind. That's Miller's horse, the blacksmith's boy." "Elias, no!" Clara begged, grabbing his pant leg. "Let it be. Please, if you go down there, the law comes. If the law comes..." "If the law comes, what?" Elias demanded. "They find out who you are. Is that it? You'd let a man beat you half to death to keep a secret?" "Yes," she screamed. "Yes, because a beating I can heal from. A rope is forever." Elias stared at her, his chest heaving. The rage was a physical thing, a red haze clouding his vision. He looked at the woman he had pulled from the snow, the woman who had planted his corn and read him poetry, now cowering in the wreckage of his home. He didn't say a word. He turned and walked out the door. "Elias!" she screamed after him. He didn't stop. He mounted his fresh horse, jammed his rifle into the scabbard, and turned the animal toward town. The saloon was quiet when Elias walked in. It was a Tuesday night, and only a few locals were nursing watered-down whiskey. The blacksmith's boy, a hulking youth of 20 named Tate, was leaning against the bar, laughing with the shopkeeper. The laughter died when Elias stepped through the bat-wing doors. He looked like a revenant. He was covered in dust, his eyes shadowed by his hat, his right hand resting loosely near the Colt Navy revolver on his hip. He walked straight to the bar. The room seemed to shrink. "Whiskey," Elias said. The bartender poured it with a shaking hand. Elias didn't drink it. He stood there, staring at Tate in the mirror behind the bar. "You lose something out my way, Tate?" Elias asked softly. Tate straightened up, puffing out his chest. "Don't know what you mean. McCrae? Loose shoe on your bay mare. Saw the tracks." Elias turned slowly to face him. "Saw the mess in my cabin. Saw the face of the woman living there." Tate sneered, glancing at his friends for courage. "That whore. She needed a lesson in manners. Came into town strutting like she was a decent folk. I just went out to see if she was as friendly as they say." The room went dead silent. Elias didn't draw his gun. He moved with the explosive speed of a striking rattlesnake. He stepped forward, grabbed Tate by the back of the head, and slammed his face into the solid oak of the bar. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage. Tate screamed, blood spraying across the wood. He tried to pull back, but Elias held him there, pinned like a butterfly. "You listen to me," Elias whispered, leaning down so his lips were inches from Tate's ear. "You never come near my land again. You never look at her again. You never speak her name. I will kill you." "I won't beat you. I won't fight you. I will put a bullet in your belly and watch you die slowly." He shoved Tate away. The boy collapsed to the floor, sobbing and clutching his shattered nose. Elias looked around the room. His gaze swept over the shopkeeper, the locals, the men who had whispered, "That goes for all of you. She is under my protection. Any man who forgets that will answer to me." He turned and walked out, leaving the silence heavy and thick behind him. When he got back to the cabin, It was empty. The mule was gone. The cart was gone. Elias cursed. A long, creative string of profanity that echoed off the canyon walls. He didn't even unsaddle his horse. He spun the animal around and kicked it into a gallop, heading for the ridge road, the only way out of the valley that the mule could manage. He caught her 3 miles up. Near the pass, the moon was full, casting a pale, ghostly light over the road. Clara was walking beside the mule, urging it forward, the baby strapped to her back. "Whoa!" Elias shouted, cutting his horse in front of the cart. Clara startled, the mule shying. She reached for the rifle in the cart, but Elias was already off his horse. He grabbed the barrel before she could bring it to bear. "Let go!" she cried, struggling with him. "Let me go! Elias! You ain't going nowhere!" He wrestled the rifle from her and tossed it into the snow. He grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her hard. "What is wrong with you? Running off in the night? Where are you gonna go, Clara?" "Away from you," she sobbed, fighting his grip. "You crazy fool! You went to town, didn't you? You heard him. Now they'll come. The sheriff will come. And they'll ask questions. And then he will come." "Who is he?" Elias roared. "Tell me." "Brantley," she screamed, the name tearing out of her throat. "Colonel Silas Brantley, the biggest cattleman in Kansas. I was his ward. I belonged to him. Do you hear me? I belonged to him and his sons. And I ran. Elias, I stole a horse and I ran. And if he finds me, he will hang me from the nearest tree." The confession hung in the cold air, steaming with her breath. Elias stared at her. The fight drained out of him. He saw the absolute terror in her eyes, not the fear of a hard winter or a beating, but the fear of a hunted animal that knows the hounds are close. "He ain't here," Elias said, his voice dropping. "This ain't Kansas. This is Wyoming territory. And you ain't his ward no more." "You don't understand," she wept, collapsing against his chest. "He owns everything. Judges, marshals. He never stops looking for what's his." Elias wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight against the cold wind. "Well, he's got to come through me first." The rain started before they got back to the cabin, a cold, driving sleet that soaked them to the bone. They put the animals in the stable, the air inside thick with the smell of damp hay and warm horseflesh. Clara was shivering uncontrollably. Elias lit the lantern hanging from a beam. The light swung, casting long, dancing shadows. "Get those wet clothes off," Elias said, turning to check the mule's hooves. "I'll bring a blanket from the house." "Don't go," she said. Elias froze. He turned slowly. Clara was standing in the center of the stable aisle. She had taken off her bonnet and her heavy coat, her hair, dark and wet, plastered to her neck. The bruise on her face was a dark stain in the lantern light, but her eyes were burning with a feverish intensity. "Clara, I'm tired of running. Elias," she whispered. She took a step toward him. "I'm tired of being cold. I'm tired of being afraid." She reached out and touched his chest, her hand resting over his heart. He could feel the heat of her palm through his wet shirt. "You shouldn't be here," Elias said, his voice rough. "You're upset. You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing." She stepped closer, pressing her body against his. She looked up at him, her lips parted, her breath coming fast. "Make me forget. Elias, just for tonight, make me forget everything else." Elias looked down at her. He saw the woman who had split wood beside him, the woman who had taught him to read, the woman who had haunted his dreams for months. The restraint he had built, brick by brick, began to crumble. He reached up and cupped her face, his thumb grazing the bruise on her cheek. "I ain't a gentle man. Clara, I don't want to be gentle," she said fiercely. She surged up on her toes and kissed him. It wasn't a tentative first kiss. It was a collision. Her mouth was hot and desperate, tasting of salt and rain. She gripped his hair, pulling him down to her. Elias made a low sound in his throat and wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her off the ground. He crushed her to him, kissing her back with a hunger that frightened him. All the frustration of the winter, all the anger at the men who had hurt her, all the loneliness of 7 years of solitude poured into that kiss. Stop, she gasped, breaking the kiss for a second to breathe. Elias froze instantly, his body rigid. He started to pull back. I'm sorry, No, she whispered, pulling him back, her nails digging into his shoulders. Don't you dare stop. I want this. I want you. He carried her to the hayloft ladder. They climbed up into the dry, sweet-smelling darkness. There were no blankets, only the piled hay. They fumbled with buttons and wet fabric, hands shaking, skin desperate for skin. When they finally came together, it was frantic and raw. There was no art to it, only need. It was a reclaiming of bodies that had been used and beaten and frozen. Elias moved with a driving intensity, trying to bury himself in her, trying to anchor her to the earth so she could never float away again. Clara met him measure for measure, crying out his name, archiving her pain in the arch of her back and the digging of her fingers into his skin. Outside, the rain hammered the roof. Inside, they burned. The morning light that filtered through the cracks in the barn wood was gray and unforgiving. Elias woke first. He was lying on his back in the hay, covered by his coat. Clara was curled beside him, her back to him. He reached out to touch her shoulder. She flinched. It was a small movement, but it felt like a slap. She sat up, pulling her dress around her, not looking at him. Clara, we should go in, she said, her voice devoid of the heat from the night before. Buck will be waking up. She stood and began to fasten her dress with trembling fingers. The distance was back. It was a wall of ice, thicker than before because now they both knew what lay behind it. Elias sat up, running a hand through his hair. He felt confused, adrift. He wanted to pull her back down, to tell her he loved her, but the words stuck in his throat. He was a cowboy, not a poet. He didn't know how to fix things that were broken in the spirit. Clara, he said again, softer this time. She paused at the top of the ladder. Don't, she said. Just don't. Time moved differently after that. The seasons blurred. 1 year bled into 2. The corn grew tall, withered, and was planted again. The herd of cattle Elias started building grew from 3 strays to 20 heads. Little Buck grew most of all. He was a sturdy child, with dark eyes and a solemn face that would break into a smile like sunrise. He had Clara's stubbornness and Elias's quiet watchfulness. One evening in late autumn, nearly 2 years after the night in the barn, Elias was sitting on the porch, whittling a toy horse. Buck, now a toddler steady on his feet, was chasing a beetle across the floorboards. Clara came out of the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. She stood watching them. The tension between her and Elias had settled into a dull ache, a constant presence that they navigated around like furniture in the dark. They shared a bed now, and sometimes they shared their bodies in the dark. But she never opened that door again. She never let him all the way in. Buck tripped over his own feet and sprawled onto the wood. He let out a cry of surprise. Elias leaned forward and scooped him up. You all right, little badger? The ground jumped up and hit you? Buck sniffled, rubbing his knee. He looked at Elias, his small hand gripping Elias's shirt. Pa fix it? He asked. The world stopped. Elias stared at the boy. He felt a lump form in his throat the size of an apple. He looked up at Clara. She was staring at the boy, her face pale. Pa fix it, Elias whispered, his voice cracking. Yeah, Pa will fix it. He rubbed the small knee, blinking back tears he would never admit to. That night, after Buck was asleep, they sat by the fire. Elias watched the flames, the sound of Pa still echoing in his ears. It changed everything. It made the lie true. It made the temporary permanent. He looked at Clara. She was mending a shirt, her needle flashing in the light. Clara, he said. She didn't look up. The boy, Buck, he's getting older. He's starting to ask questions. He's starting to look like... Elias hesitated. He doesn't look like me. Clara, and he doesn't look much like you either. Clara's hand froze. Is he really not yours? Elias asked. It was the question that had haunted him for 3 years. I need to know. If kin comes looking, I need to know whose blood he is. Clara set the sewing down in her lap. She looked at Elias, and her eyes were old, ancient with a grief he couldn't touch. "He is safe here," she said. "He is happy. He has a father. That ain't an answer. It is the only answer you will get." She stood up, gathering her sewing. She walked to the bedroom door and stopped, her hand on the frame. She didn't turn around. "Please, Elias," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If you love me, if you love him, don't ask that again." She went into the room and closed the door. Elias sat alone in the firelight, listening to the wind. He knew then that the secrets she kept were the load-bearing walls of their life. If he pulled too hard on the truth, the whole house would come down. "All right," he whispered to the empty room. "All right." The years moved over the Laramie Basin like shadows of clouds across the grass, slow, constant, and heavy with change. The shack that had once been a hovel of mud and logs had grown. Elias had felled lodgepole pines from the high ridges, peeling them white and stacking them true to add 2 rooms and a porch that faced the rising sun. He had built a barn that didn't leak and corrals that stood straight against the wind. It was the summer of 1875. The air smelled of sage and heating dust, a dry, resinous scent that coated the back of the throat. Little Buck was no longer a bundle in a crate. He was 7 years old, a creature of knees and elbows and boundless energy. He had hair the color of a raven's wing and eyes that watched the world with a solemn, unnerving intelligence. "Keep your elbow up," Elias said, his voice low. They were standing by the creek bed, 100 yards from the house. Buck held a cut-down .22 rifle, the stock pressed against his small shoulder. He was biting his lip in concentration. "Like this, Pa?" Buck asked, raising his right arm slightly. "That is it. Take a breath. Let half of it out. Squeeze. Don't pull." The crack of the rifle was thin in the vast silence of the valley. A tin can perched on a fence post 20 yards away spun into the air, pinging sharply. "I got it!" Buck shouted, lowering the gun and grinning. A gap-toothed expression that made Elias's chest ache with a fierce, protective pride. "You got it. Sure enough," Elias said, ruffling the boy's hair. "You got a steady hand. Buck, a shooter's hand." From the porch, Clara watched them. She wiped her hands on her apron, a smudge of charcoal on her thumb. She had been drawing, sketching the line of the cottonwoods on a scrap of wrapping paper while the stew simmered. It was a habit she had picked up again as the boy grew, a quiet rebellion against the endless chores of ranch life. She saw Elias lean down and say something to the boy, saw Buck look up at him with hero worship shining in his face. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. It happened every time she saw them together, every time the bond between them thickened like scar tissue. It was a beautiful, terrible lie, and she was the architect of it. "Come on in," she called out, her voice carrying over the sound of the water. "Supper is ready." Buck ran toward her, the rifle handed off to Elias. He scrambled up the steps and hugged her waist. "Ma, I hit the can. First try." "I saw," Clara said, smoothing his hair. "You're getting too big for your britches. Go wash your hands, and use soap, not just water." As Buck thundered into the house, Elias mounted the steps slowly. He leaned the rifle against the wall and looked at her. His face had weathered more in the last 7 years. The lines around his eyes were deeper, etched by sun and wind, and the gray in his beard had claimed more territory. But he was strong, solid as an oak. "He is a natural," Elias said. "He rides like a Comanche and shoots like a scout." "He is 7, Clara said quietly. "He should be learning his letters, not how to kill." "He needs to know both," Elias said, his tone mild but firm. "World ain't a library. Clara, it is a hard country." He reached out to touch her arm, a gesture of casual intimacy. Clara didn't flinch, but she didn't lean into it either. She stood still, enduring the touch rather than welcoming it. Elias felt the subtle resistance, the invisible wall that went up the moment he got too close. He dropped his hand. "Stew smells good," he said, walking past her into the house. Clara stood on the porch for a moment longer. watching the horizon. She was always watching the horizon. She told herself she was looking for storms, but she knew she was looking for dust. For riders? For the past she had outrun but never outpaced. That night, the silence in the bedroom was heavy. They lay in the large bed Elias had built, the quilt pulled up to their chins. The window was open, letting in the sound of crickets and the distant yip of a coyote. They lived as husband and wife in every way but the law. To the town, to the few neighbors who passed through. They were the McCrays, but there was no paper in the courthouse, and there was no ring on her finger. Elias had asked her once, 3 years ago. She had cried and said she couldn't, that she wasn't free in the eyes of God until her past was buried. He hadn't asked again. Elias turned on his side, draping an arm over her waist. She was warm, smelling of lavender soap. He pulled her closer, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "Clara," he whispered. She stiffened. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but he felt it. "I am tired." "Elias," she said softly. "You are always tired lately," he murmured, kissing her shoulder. "You are here, but you ain't here. Where do you go, Clara?" "I am right here," she lied. "No, you give me your days, and you give me your body sometimes, but you keep the rest locked up in a box I can't find the key to." He propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her in the moonlight. "Are you fixing to leave? Is that it? Waiting for the boy to get big enough to travel?" Clara turned her head, her eyes wide and frightened in the dark. "No, I would never take him from you. You are his father." "I am his father," Elias repeated, bitterness creeping into his voice. "But who are you? 7 years, and I still don't know who you were before that snowstorm." "I am the woman who cooks your meals," she said, her voice trembling. "I am the woman who warms your bed. Why isn't that enough?" "Because I love you," Elias said. The words hung in the air, heavy and terrifying, and I feel like I am holding onto a handful of water. She didn't answer. She couldn't. To answer would be to open the floodgates. She turned away from him, curling into a ball. Elias sighed, the sound of a man defeated by a ghost, and rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling until dawn. 2 days later, the fragile piece of their existence shattered. Elias hitched the team to the wagon to go into town for supplies. They needed flour, coffee, and nails for the new roof on the smokehouse. Buck begged to go, wanting to see the candy jars at the general store, but Clara kept him back. She had a bad feeling, a prickling at the base of her neck that she had learned to trust. "You stay and help me weed the garden," she told the boy. "Pa will bring you a stick of peppermint." Elias rode out alone. The town of Laramie had grown. Too, the railroad had brought money, noise, and strangers. The streets were busier, filled with drovers, miners, and men in suits looking to buy land cheap and sell it high. Elias tied the team in front of the mercantile and went inside. The shopkeeper, a new man named Henderson, who didn't know the gossip of 7 years ago, greeted him warmly. "Morning, Mr. McCray. Fine weather." "It will hold," Elias said, reading the list Clara had written. "I need a 50-pound sack of flour, 10 pounds of coffee beans, and a keg of nails." While Henderson measured out the coffee, the bell above the door jingled. A man walked in. He didn't look like a cowboy. He wore a dust-coated suit, a bowler hat, and boots that had seen more pavement than stirrups. He had the sharp, predatory look of a man who asked questions for a living. He walked to the counter, standing next to Elias. He took a piece of paper from his pocket and unfolded it. "Excuse me," the stranger said. His voice was flat, carrying a clipped Eastern accent. "I am looking for information regarding a woman. Would have arrived in the territory around 68 or 69. Young, dark hair, striking features." Elias froze. His hand, resting on the counter, didn't move, but every muscle in his body went tight. "A lot of women come through here," Henderson said, glancing at the paper. "What is her name?" "She goes by many names," the stranger said. "But she would have had a child with her, a newborn, or was heavy with the child when she arrived." The man paused, looking around the store. She is wanted in connection with a felony in Kansas, a serious matter involving the Brantley estate. The name hit Elias like a hammer blow to the chest. Brantley. The name Clara had screamed in her fever. The name she had whispered in terror on the Ridge Road. There was a reward, the stranger continued. A substantial one. The family is very keen to recover the stolen property. Elias turned his head slowly to look at the man. What kind of property? The stranger looked at Elias, assessing him with cold, dead eyes. A child, a boy. He would be about 7 now, the heir to the Brantley fortune. The world tilted on its axis. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. A boy, 7 years old. An heir. Ain't seen nobody like that, Henderson said, shaking his head. Most folks here mind their own business. I am sure, the stranger said. He placed a silver dollar on the counter. If you hear anything, I am staying at the hotel. My name is Vance, Pinkerton Agency. Vance turned and walked out. Elias stood there, the roar of blood in his ears drowning out the shopkeeper's voice. The heir, not a bastard, not a mistake, an heir. Mr. McCrae, you want those nails? Elias blinked, coming back to the room. Put it on my tab, he rasped. He grabbed the flour and the coffee, forgetting the nails, forgetting the peppermint, and walked out into the blinding sunlight. He drove the team hard on the way back. The wagon bounced and rattled over the ruts. But Elias didn't spare the horses. His mind was a chaotic storm of betrayal and fear. She had lied. For 7 years. She had looked him in the eye and lied. He's not mine, she had said. I'm just a wet nurse. Then she had let him believe the boy was a bastard. A shameful secret. But an heir? That meant the boy belonged to the powerful. That meant the danger wasn't just shame. It was a war. When the cabin came into view, he saw Clara in the garden, wearing her sunbonnet. Buck was sitting on the fence, swinging his legs. It looked so peaceful, so permanent. It was a mirage. Elias pulled the wagon up to the barn with a violence that startled the chickens. He jumped down and marched toward the house. Clara stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. She saw his face, the dark thunder in his eyes, the set of his jaw, and she knew. The color drained from her cheeks. Buck, she said, her voice tight. Go to the barn. Curry the horses. But Pa just got back. Go, she snapped. Buck scrambled off the fence, looking frightened, and ran for the barn. Clara stood her ground as Elias stomped up the steps. He stopped 3 feet from her, breathing hard. Pack your things, Clara said, her voice shaking but decisive. We have to leave. Tonight. Elias stared at her. You know, I felt it, she whispered. I felt it the moment you rode in. Someone was asking, weren't they? Someone from Kansas. A Pinkerton, Elias said, spitting the word. Asking about a woman and a stolen child? Asking about the Brantley heir? Clara flinched as if he had struck her. She turned and ran into the house, grabbing a trunk from the corner. She started throwing clothes into it. Buck's shirts, her shawl, a box of cartridges. We can go west, she said, talking fast, manic. Over the divide, to Oregon. They won't look there. If we leave now, we can be in the pass by midnight. Stop, Elias said. He stood in the doorway, blocking the light. We can't stop. They will hang me, Elias, and they will take him. They will take Buck and turn him into one of them. I said stop, Elias roared. He crossed the room and grabbed her wrist, yanking her away from the trunk. Let me go, she screamed, clawing at his hand. We have to run. I am done running, Elias shouted back, shaking her. I have been running for you for 7 years. I have hidden you, fed you, lied for you. And what did you give me? More lies. He shoved her back against the table. He is the Brantley heir. That boy, my boy. He is not your boy, Clara yelled, the words tearing out of her in a sob. He is theirs. He is blood and money and land to them. He is the son of a man you laid down with, Elias accused, the jealousy that had simmered for years finally boiling over. A rich man's son. I didn't lay down with him. Clara fell to her knees, covering her face with her hands. The sound that came out of her was a howl, a raw, animal noise of pure agony. "I didn't lay down with him," she sobbed into the floorboards. "I fought him. God help me, I fought him." The silence that followed was absolute. The rage in Elias's chest turned to ice. He stood frozen, looking down at the woman crumpled on his floor. "What?" he whispered. Clara looked up. Her face was wet, her eyes red and wild. She looked shattered. "It was Samuel Brantley," she whispered, the truth finally bleeding out. "The Colonel's eldest son. I was 16. I was a maid in the big house. He cornered me in the tack room. He was drunk. He hurt me. Elias, he hurt me so badly." Elias felt like the floor was dropping out from under him. He sank onto the bench, his hands trembling. "When I told the Colonel I was with the child? When I begged for help? He laughed. He said a maid couldn't carry a Brantley. He threw me out of the bunkhouse." She took a shuddering breath. But then Samuel died. A fire in the barn. He was passed out in the hay. They say I started it. She looked Elias in the eye. "Maybe I did. Maybe I dropped the lantern. Maybe I just watched it burn. I don't remember. All I remember is the screaming. Clara, I ran," she continued, her voice hollow. "I had the baby in a ditch 3 months later. And then I heard they were looking, not for me, for the boy. Because Samuel was dead, and the Colonel needed an heir. He needed the bloodline to keep the land trust." She stood up slowly, wiping her face. "They don't want a son. Elias, they want a deed. They want a key to a vault. If they get Buck, they will crush everything good in him. They will make him cruel. They will make him like them." Elias sat there, the weight of the revelation crushing him. He thought of Buck, the sweet, serious boy who cried when he skinned his knee, who loved the horses, who called him Pa. He thought of the monster who had sired him. He thought of Clara, carrying this horror alone in the silence of her heart, terrified that if Elias knew the boy was born of rape and murder, he would turn them out. "Why didn't you tell me?" Elias asked, his voice breaking. 7 years. Clara, why didn't you trust me?" "Because I was ashamed," she cried. "Because look at you. You look at me differently now. Everyone does. I am the whore who burned a man to death. I am the vessel of something evil." "No," Elias said, but the denial was weak. He was reeling. "And you," Clara pointed a shaking finger at him, "you are a good man. Elias, a righteous man. But you are proud. Could you have loved him the same? If you knew every time you looked at him, you were looking at the face of the man who raped me." The question hung in the air like smoke. Elias opened his mouth, but no words came. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to say it didn't matter, but the image of the violence, the deception, the sheer weight of the lie, it choked him. "I built my life around a lie, didn't I?" Elias whispered. "This house, this family, it is all built on a graveyard." "It was the only way to survive," Clara said. "I can't," Elias said. He stood up, knocking the bench over. "I can't be here right now. Elias, we have to go. The Pinkerton is in town." "You ain't going nowhere," Elias snapped. "You stay put. I need air." He walked out the door. He walked past the barn where Buck was brushing the mare, humming a tune. He didn't look at the boy. He couldn't. He saw the ghost of a dead man in the boy's dark eyes now, and it made him sick. Elias saddled his horse with jerky, angry movements. He mounted and rode out, not toward town, but up toward the high ridge, toward the snow line, toward the cold silence where a man didn't have to think about the complexity of sin. Clara watched him go from the window. She watched until he was a speck against the gray sky. Then she sank to the floor and wept, not for herself, but for the little boy in the barn who had just lost his father, even if he didn't know it yet. She waited. The sun went down. The moon rose. She fed Buck and put him to bed, telling him Pa was out checking for wolves. She sat by the door with the rifle across her lap, waiting for the Pinkertons, or for Elias. She didn't know which one she feared more. Days passed. 1, 2, 3. Elias did not come back. The silence of the ranch grew deafening, broken only by the wind and the questions of a 7-year-old boy who couldn't understand why his world had suddenly gone quiet. "Where's Pa?" Buck asked on the third evening, tugging at Clara's skirt. "He is riding the line," Clara said, her voice brittle as glass. "He never stays away this long." Buck said, "Did I do something bad? Is he mad about the rifle?" Clara dropped to her knees and pulled the boy into her arms, burying her face in his hair. "No, baby, you're good. You are the best thing in this world. Pa isn't mad at you. He is mad at me," she thought. "He is mad at the truth." She looked out the window at the empty trail. She knew the Pinkerton was still out there. She knew the Brantleys were coming. And she knew that for the first time in 7 years, she was truly, completely alone. The fourth day of Elias's absence broke with a sky the color of a bruised plum. The clouds hung low and heavy over the Laramie Basin, promising a storm that smelled of ozone and wet sage. Clara stood on the porch, her hand shading her eyes against the strange, filtered light, watching the trail that snaked down from the ridge. She had not slept. Her eyes felt as though they were filled with sand, and her heart beat with a frantic, bird-like rhythm against her ribs. Beside her, the rifle leaned against the doorframe, cold and ready. "Ma!" Buck's voice came from the doorway, small and uncertain. "Is Pa coming back?" Clara turned, forcing a smile she did not feel. "He is coming. Buck, the line is long. Sometimes it takes time. He missed my birthday," Buck whispered. Clara felt a sharp crack in her chest. She had forgotten. In the terror of the stranger and the revelation, she had forgotten that yesterday the boy had turned 8. "Oh, baby, we will celebrate when he gets home. We will make a cake." "There he is," Buck said, pointing. Clara spun around. A rider was cresting the ridge, silhouetted against the dark clouds. He was slumped in the saddle, the horse moving with a slow, plodding gait that spoke of exhaustion. It was Elias. Clara didn't wait. She ran down the steps, her skirts gathering mud, and sprinted toward the gate. As the horse drew closer, her relief turned to shock. Elias looked as if he had been dragged through hell. His left eye was swollen shut, a grotesque purple bulb. His lip was split, caked with dried blood. His knuckles were raw meat, wrapped in strips of dirty cloth. He wasn't wearing his hat. It was gone, leaving his graying hair matted with sweat and dust. He pulled the horse to a halt and looked down at her. His good eye was bloodshot, burning with a cold, hard light she had never seen before. "Elias," she breathed, reaching for the bridle. "My God, what happened?" He slid from the saddle, his boots hitting the mud with a heavy thud. He staggered slightly, grabbing the saddle horn for balance. "I found him," he rasped. His voice was like gravel grinding together. "Who?" "The Pinkerton, Vance." Elias spat a glob of blood into the dirt. "Found him camped down by the creek, waiting for a wire from Laramie." Clara's hands flew to her mouth. You killed him?" "No," Elias said grimly. "Though I reckon he wishes I had. I broke his jaw, broke his ribs. Told him if he ever came near this valley again, I would skin him alive." "Elias, you can't fight the law like that. He's an agent." "He ain't the law," Elias growled, pushing past her toward the house. "He is a hired dog for the Brantleys. And he ain't alone." Clara followed him, panic rising in her throat like bile. "What do you mean?" Elias stopped at the water barrel on the porch, plunging his whole head into the icy water. He came up sputtering, wiping his face with his sleeve. "I went through his saddlebags. He sent a wire 3 days ago. To Kansas. Told them he found the boy. Told them to send the wagon." Clara felt her knees give way. She grabbed the porch railing to keep from falling. "They are coming," she whispered. "They are coming for him." "Yeah," Elias said, staring at the dark horizon. "They are coming." "We have to go," Clara said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Elias, listen to me. I will take the mule. I will take Buck. We will go north, into the deep woods. You stay here. Tell them I left. Tell them you kicked me out when you found out the truth. They won't hurt you if I am gone." Elias turned slowly to look at her. The water dripped from his beard, mixing with the blood on his shirt. "Is that what you think? It is the only way. You said it yourself. You built your life on a lie. I won't let that lie destroy you too. I brought this storm. Elias, let me take it with me." She moved to go inside, to grab the boy, but Elias reached out. His hand, battered and swollen, clamped onto her arm. It wasn't a violent grip, but it was immovable. "No," he said. "Elias, please, I can't let them take him, and I can't let them kill you." "Look at me," he commanded. Clara looked up, tears streaming down her face. She saw the anger in his face. Yes, she saw the betrayal that still lingered in the set of his jaw. But beneath it, she saw something else. A fierce, terrifying possession. "I rode for 3 days thinking about it," Elias said, his voice low and shaking. "Thinking about who his sire is, thinking about the blood in his veins, thinking about you lying to me every night for 7 years. "I know," she sobbed. "I am sorry. And then I thought about the time he fell in the creek and I fished him out," Elias continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "I thought about the first time he sat on a horse. I thought about the way he looks at me when he is scared. That man in Kansas, that Brantley, he might have provided the seed. Clara, but he ain't the father." Elias pulled her closer, ignoring the mud and the blood between them. "I walked the floor with him when he had the croup. I taught him to shoot. I put the food in his belly and the clothes on his back. That boy is mine. I raised him. I bled for him. And I will be damned to eternal hell before I let some rich man take my son because of a piece of paper." Clara stared at him, her breath catching. Do you still want him, even knowing?" "He ain't a thing to be wanted or not wanted." "Clara," Elias said fiercely, "he is my son, and you are my wife, in every way that matters to God. We ain't running. This is our land. This is our home. And if they want him, they are going to have to step over my dead body to get him." They didn't have much time. Elias estimated they had a day, maybe 2, before the Brantley party arrived from the railhead. The preparation was grim and silent work. Elias took the shutters he had built for winter storms, heavy planks of pine, and bolted them over the windows. He cut firing loops into the wood, narrow slits that allowed a rifle barrel to pass through but offered no target from the outside. Clara melted lead on the stove, casting bullets. The smell of hot metal filled the cabin, acrid and sharp. Her hands were steady now. The fear had burned away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She was a mother protecting her young, and there is no creature on earth more dangerous. Buck watched them with wide eyes. He sensed the fear in the house, the vibration of violence in the air. "Pa?" he asked, watching Elias clean the Winchester. "Are we fighting Indians?" Elias looked up, his face softening. "No, son, not Indians. Just some bad men who want to take things that don't belong to them." "Like the man who hurt Ma?" Elias paused. "Yeah, like him." "I can fight," Buck said, reaching for his .22. "I can shoot the can." "I know you can," Elias said gently. "But this time, I need you to do the hardest job. I need you to hide. You are the treasure. Buck, if the bad men see you, we lose. You understand?" Buck nodded solemnly. "I understand." They took him up the ridge, a quarter-mile behind the cabin. There was a thicket of aspen and chokecherry bushes there, dense and tangled. In the center, hidden by a fallen log and a screen of brush, was a small hollow Elias had shown him years ago while tracking deer. "You stay here," Elias told him, handing him a canteen and a blanket. "You don't come out, not if you hear shooting, not if you hear shouting, not even if you hear me or Ma calling you. You wait until I come and say the secret word." "What is the secret word?" Buck whispered, the gravity of the game settling on him. Elias thought for a moment. He looked at Clara, then back at the boy. "The word is family. You don't move until you hear me say family." Elias kissed the boy's forehead, holding him tight for a long second. Then he stood up and walked away without looking back. Clara lingered, smoothing the hair back from her son's face. "Be brave," she whispered. Be invisible. She left him there in the green silence of the woods and followed Elias back down to the house that was about to become a fortress. Night fell, vast and indifferent. The clouds had cleared, leaving a sky dusted with stars so bright they looked like spilled sugar. Elias and Clara sat on the porch, the rifles resting against their knees. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the heavy silence of secrets, but the companionable silence of soldiers waiting for dawn. Does it hurt? Clara asked, looking at his swollen hand. Only when I breathe, Elias joked weakly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of folded paper. I wrote something. Inside, while you were filling the canteens. He handed it to her. Clara unfolded it in the moonlight. It was written in charcoal on the back of one of her drawings. The handwriting was rough, blocky, the letters of a man who didn't hold a pen often. I, Elias McCrae, being of sound mind, do hereby declare that the boy known as Buck McCrae is my natural-born son. I acknowledge him as my blood and my heir. Any man saying otherwise is a liar. I leave him this land, my horses, and my name. I leave my wife. Clara. Everything else. Signed, Elias McCrae. Clara read it twice. The tears came hot and fast, blurring the charcoal words. It was a lie, a legal lie, but it was the truest thing he had ever written. By claiming Buck as his natural son, he was stripping the Brantleys of their argument of illegitimacy. He was staking a claim that went deeper than DNA. You would perjure yourself before God, she whispered. God knows the truth, Elias said, looking at the stars. God knows I am his father more than that dead man ever was. This is for the courts. If I don't make it, this paper gives you a fighting chance. The judge might listen. Clara folded the paper and tucked it into her bodice, next to her heart. She turned to him, sliding off the bench to kneel between his legs. She reached up and touched his bruised face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I love you, she said. I have loved you since the moment you didn't ask me my name that first night. I was just too broken to say it. Elias looked down at her. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. There was only the deep, weary love of a man who has found his place in the world. I reckon we are both a little broken, Clara, he whispered. That is how the light gets in. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't like the first time in the barn, frantic and desperate. And it wasn't like the nights in the dark, dutiful and distant. It was slow. It was tender. It tasted of salt and blood and forgiveness. Take me inside, she whispered against his lips. Clara, the watch. They won't come in the dark. They are city men. They will come at dawn. Take me inside. Elias, please! He stood up, wincing, and pulled her to her feet. He led her into the cabin, barring the door behind them. In the darkness of the room, they stripped each other of the layers of wool and cotton, exposing the scars on their skin and the scars on their souls. They made love on the quilt Elias's mother had stitched, the rifle leaning against the bedpost. It was a reclaiming. Elias touched her with trembling hands, worshipping the body that had survived fire and snow. Clara held him as if she could fuse her bones to his, anchoring him to the earth so death couldn't drag him away. She cried, silent tears that ran into her hair. He kissed them away. There were no words left to say. They spoke with their hands, their breath, the beating of their hearts against each other's ribs. When it was over, they lay entangled, listening to the wind. Elias fell asleep with his hand on her stomach, protective even in his dreams. Clara stayed awake, watching the moonlight crawl across the floorboards, praying to a God she hadn't spoken to in years. Let him live, she prayed. Take me, take the land, but let him live. The dawn arrived with a deceptive beauty. The sky turned a pale, translucent pink, lighting up the peaks of the snowy range. The meadow was covered in dew, sparkling like diamonds. Elias was up before the sun. He checked the loads in the Winchester. He checked the Colt on his hip. He drank a cup of cold coffee and watched the tree line. Do you see them? Clara asked, coming up behind him. She was wearing her work dress, her hair braided tight against her head. She held the old shotgun, a formidable weapon at close range. "Not yet," Elias said. "But the birds have stopped singing." 10 minutes later, they emerged from the trees. There were 6 of them. They rode fine horses, not range ponies. In the lead was a man in a black suit, flanked by 5 men wearing long dusters. The sun glinted off the metal of rifles resting across their saddles. They rode boldly, right up to the gate, stopping 50 yards from the porch. Elias stepped out, the Winchester cradled in his arm. He didn't raise it, but the threat was clear. Clara stood in the doorway, the shotgun hidden behind the frame. "That is far enough," Elias called out. His voice was steady, booming across the yard. The man in the suit nudged his horse forward. He was older, gray-haired, with the arrogant bearing of a man who bought and sold people. This was the lawyer. "Are you Elias McCrae?" the man shouted. "I am. My name is Thaddeus Moore. I represent the estate of Colonel Silas Brantley of Kansas. I have a federal warrant for the arrest of a woman known as Clara, also known as the thief of the Brantley heir." Moore pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and held it up. "And I have a writ of custody for the male child, roughly 7 years of age. We know they are here." McCrae: "We have sworn testimony from the Pinkerton agent you assaulted." "There ain't no Brantley heir here," Elias shouted back. "Just my wife and my son. Do not play games with me, sir," Moore snapped. "We know the child is the illegitimate son of Samuel Brantley. He is the property of the estate. Surrender the woman and the boy, and we will leave you to your miserable patch of dirt. Refuse, and you will be charged with kidnapping and obstruction of justice." "The boy is mine," Elias roared. "I sign my name to it. He is a McCrae." "A piece of paper written by a cowboy does not override blood," Moore sneered. He motioned to the men behind him. They spread out, unlimbering their rifles. "We are taking the boy, now. You take one more step, and I will drop you from that saddle," Elias warned, raising the Winchester. "This is a federal warrant," Moore screamed, his face red. "Kill him." The command hung in the air for a split second, absolute and terrifying. The man to Moore's right raised a Sharps carbine. Elias didn't wait. He fired. The crack of the Winchester shattered the morning. The man with the Sharps jerked backward, his shoulder exploding in a spray of red. He tumbled from his horse. The yard erupted. Bullets slammed into the logs of the cabin, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Elias dove behind the water barrel, working the lever of his rifle. Crack, crack, crack. He fired rapidly, suppressing the riders, forcing them to scatter for the cover of the trees and the barn. "Clara, keep down!" he yelled. Clara didn't keep down. She stepped into the doorway, the shotgun raised. A rider was charging the porch, a pistol in his hand, thinking to flank Elias. Clara pulled the trigger. The recoil bruised her shoulder, but the spread of buckshot caught the horse in the chest. The animal screamed and went down, throwing the rider into the dust. He scrambled up, aiming at Elias's exposed back. Clara racked the second shell. She didn't close her eyes. She aimed at the man's chest and fired. The man flew backward as if kicked by a mule, landing in the mud and not moving. "Get back!" Elias screamed at her, spinning around to fire at the trees. A bullet whizzed past his ear, singing like a hornet. Another punched through the water barrel, soaking his leg. The Brantley men were professional. They were setting up a crossfire. 2 from the barn, 2 from the trees. Moore had retreated to the safety of the gate, shouting orders. "Burn them out!" Moore yelled. "Throw a torch on the roof!" One of the men near the barn lit a rag stuffed into a bottle of coal oil. He stepped out to throw it. Elias stood up to take the shot. He had a clear line. He settled the sight on the man's chest. Crack! Elias flinched. The shot hadn't come from his gun. It hadn't come from the riders. It had come from the ridge. The man with the firebomb dropped the bottle, clutching his leg. A small, dark stain appeared on his thigh. He fell, screaming. Elias looked up. High on the ridge, a puff of white smoke drifted from the aspen thicket. A .22 rifle. "Buck!" Elias screamed in horror. "No!" The boy had disobeyed. He was trying to help. He was shooting the can. The distraction cost Elias everything. A rider in the trees saw Elias stand up. He took his time. He aimed. The bullet hit Elias in the side, just above the hip. It felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. The air left Elias's lungs. He spun around, his legs going numb, and crashed onto the porch planks. The Winchester clattered away from his hand. "Elias!" Clara screamed. She dropped the empty shotgun and threw herself over him, shielding his body with hers. "Don't!" Elias gasped, blood bubbling between his teeth. "Don't let them get him!" Another shot rang out, hitting the door frame inches from Clara's head. Then, silence. "Hold fire!" Moore shouted. "We have them pinned! Move in!" Elias looked up at Clara. His vision was swimming, gray spots dancing at the edges. He saw her face, terrified and fierce. He looked past her, up to the ridge. He saw a small figure standing up in the brush, a toy rifle in his hands, staring down at his fallen father. "Buck," Elias whispered, and the darkness rose up to swallow him. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of Elias's side, just above the hip bone, missing the gut by less than an inch. It was a clean wound, in and out, but it had bled enough to soak the porch planks crimson and turn Elias's face the color of old parchment. Clara did not scream. She did not panic. The moment the shooting stopped and the Brantley men retreated to lick their wounds and regroup, a cold, terrifying calm descended upon her. She dragged Elias inside, her boots slipping in his blood. She tore the sheets from their bed, the same sheets where they had made love only hours before, and packed the wound tight. For 3 weeks, death sat in the corner of the cabin, waiting. Elias burned with fever. The infection set in on the 3rd day, turning the wound angry and hot. Clara fought it with boiling water, poultices of slippery elm and plantain, and a bottle of whiskey forced between his teeth. She slept in a chair by the bed, the shotgun across her lap, waking at the slightest change in his breathing. Buck was her shadow. The boy had stopped playing. He had stopped smiling. He moved through the house with a solemnity that broke Clara's heart. He fetched water. He chopped wood, struggling with the heavy axe until his hands blistered. He sat by Elias's bed for hours, holding the big, calloused hand of the man he called father, whispering stories about the horses to keep him tethered to the living world. Outside, the valley was quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath. The Brantley men had not left the territory. They had withdrawn to Laramie, trading their rifles for wrists. They were waiting for Elias to die, or for the law to do their work for them. Clara took over the ranch. She rode the fence line with the Winchester scabbarded on her saddle, her eyes scanning every draw and coulee. She moved the small herd to higher pasture where they were harder to rustle. She became a creature of iron and vigilance, shedding the soft skin of the woman Elias had held and revealing the survivor who had walked out of a Kansas blizzard. News of the shootout traveled fast, carried by the wind and the gossip. In the saloons and feed stores of Laramie, the name McCrae was on every tongue. "Damn fool," the blacksmith said, hammering a shoe. "Taking on the Brantley money. He will hang for it." "Maybe," a ranch hand countered, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "But he stood off 6 men, and he claims the boy is his. A man doesn't take a bullet for a stray calf." The town was divided. To the wealthy cattlemen who feared the precedent of defiance, Elias was a dangerous anarchist. To the smallholders and the dirt farmers, he was a folk hero, a man standing on his own porch, defending his own blood against the Eastern money. Then the sheriff came. He rode out alone, a white flag tied to his rifle barrel. Clara met him at the gate, the shotgun leveled at his chest. "Put it down, Mrs. McCrae," Sheriff Miller said. Keeping his hands high, he looked tired. He was a local man, caught between the law and his neighbors. "State your business," Clara said. "I have a paper here. Judge Holloway signed it this morning. It is a warrant for your arrest. Clara, kidnapping, grand larceny, and attempted murder of a federal agent." Clara didn't flinch. "And Elias?" "Nothing on Elias yet, except harboring a fugitive. But if he dies, They will pin the whole mess on him and take the boy. If he lives. Well, Holloway's a hanging judge when it comes to property rights. I am not going with you. Sheriff, I didn't come to take you, Miller said, looking at the house. I came to warn you. Thaddeus Moore is bringing a motion to the court next week. They are going to petition for immediate custody of the child. They say Elias is unfit. They say you are a criminal. They are bringing in more men. Deputies this time. Real ones. Clara lowered the gun slightly. Why are you telling me this? Miller spat into the dirt. Because I knew Elias before the war. He is a stubborn mule, but he is honest. And I don't like hired guns from Kansas telling me how to run my county. He turned his horse. You have got a week, Clara. If you run, they will catch you. If you stay, God help you. When Clara told Elias, he was sitting up for the first time, pale and shaking from the effort. He listened to the news of the warrant and the custody hearing with his eyes closed. Get me paper, he rasped. And a pen. You need to rest, Clara said, adjusting his pillows. I can rest when I am dead. Get the paper, he wrote with a trembling hand, sweat beading on his forehead. It was a letter addressed to a man named Jedediah Grant, a United States Marshal in Cheyenne. Grant had been Elias's sergeant during the war, a man who owed Elias his life twice over. Send Buck to the stage stop, Elias ordered. Folding the letter, tell him to give this to the driver. Pay him $1 to see it put in Grant's hand personally. What will a marshal do? Clara asked. He will ensure a fair fight, Elias said grimly. Or at least a public one. Holloway might be bought, but Grant answers to Washington. If we are going to court, we are going to turn over every rock in Kansas. The next week was a blur of pain and preparation. Elias forced himself out of bed, practicing standing, practicing walking. He would collapse after 10 steps, gray-faced and gasping. But an hour later he would try again. He refused to be carried into that courtroom. He refused to look weak. The Brantleys returned to Laramie in force. Colonel Silas Brantley himself had not come. He was too old and too grand for Wyoming mud. But he had sent his younger son, Julian, and a retinue of lawyers. They took over the best hotel in town, holding court in the dining room, buying drinks and spreading stories about the whore who stole our brother's legacy. They painted Clara as a seductress, a thief who had seduced the noble Samuel Brantley, murdered him to cover her theft, and fled with the heir to ransom him later. It was a story the respectable women of the town found delicious and horrifying. On the morning of the hearing, Elias McCrae dressed in his best suit, black wool, moth-eaten but brushed clean. He strapped his gun belt on, though he knew he would have to surrender it at the door. He looked like a ghost of himself, gaunt and hollow-eyed. But when he put his hat on, he looked like a king. They took the wagon. Clara drove. Buck sat between them, wearing a suit cut down from one of Elias's old shirts. He held Elias's hand the whole way. Are they going to take me, Pa? Buck asked as the town came into view. Elias squeezed the small hand. No, we are going to tell the truth, and the truth is a shield. Buck, remember that. The courtroom was packed. It smelled of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and the sharp, acidic scent of anticipation. Every bench was full. Men stood along the back walls. The jury box was empty. This was a preliminary hearing before a judge, a battle of motions and writs. Judge Holloway sat behind the high bench. He was a severe man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that had seen too much frontier sin to have any pity left. Thaddeus Moore stood for the plaintiffs. He was polished, articulate, and oozing confidence. Julian Brantley sat behind him, a younger, softer version of the man who had raped Clara, watching her with a look of bored disdain. Elias and Clara sat at the defendant's table. There was no lawyer for them. They had no money for one. This court is in session, Holloway boomed. Matter of the estate of Silas Brantley versus Clara Doe and Elias McCrae, custody of the minor child known as Buck. Moore stood up, hooking his thumbs in his vest. Your Honor, the facts are simple. This woman, he gestured to Clara as if she were a pile of refuse, was a servant in the Brantley household. She engaged in illicit relations with the late Samuel Brantley. When he died tragically, she absconded with his unborn child. She is a fugitive from justice. She has no legal standing. The child is the sole male heir to one of the largest estates in Kansas. We petition the court to return the stolen property to its rightful guardians immediately." Holloway looked at Clara. "Do you deny you are the woman from the Brantley estate?" Clara stood up. Her legs shook, but her voice was clear. "I am Clara. I do not deny that." "Do you deny the child is Samuel Brantley's?" "I do not." A murmur went through the crowd. "She admits it. The whore admits it." "Then I fail to see the conflict," Holloway said, reaching for his gavel. "The child belongs to the father's family." "Objection!" Elias's voice cracked through the room. He struggled to his feet, gripping the table for support. His face was white with pain, but his eyes blazed. "Sit down, Mr. McCrae," Holloway warned. "You are barely a party to this." "I am the boy's father," Elias shouted. "I am the one who fed him. I am the one who clothed him. I am the one who taught him right from wrong. Where were the Brantleys when he was freezing in a shack? Where were they when he had the fever?" "They were looking for him," Moore interjected smoothly. "Searching for the child you helped hide." "They were not looking for a child," Elias retorted. "They were looking for a deed, and I have a witness who can prove it." "We have no other witnesses listed," the judge said impatiently. "I am the witness," Clara said. She stepped forward, moving out from behind the table. She walked to the center of the room, standing in the pool of light from the high windows. She looked at Julian Brantley, who shifted uncomfortably. She looked at the women in the front row who were whispering behind their fans. "I wish to testify," Clara said. "I wish to tell the court how the child was conceived. And why did I run?" Holloway stared at her. "This is highly irregular, and likely indecent." "It is the truth," Clara said. "And if this court cares about the welfare of the child, you will hear it." Holloway hesitated, then nodded. "Proceed, but be brief." Clara took a breath. The room went silent. She could hear the buzzing of a fly against the glass. She stripped away the shame she had worn like a coat for 8 years. She stood naked in her truth. "I was 16, she began. "I was scrubbing the floor in the tack room. Samuel Brantley came in. He had been drinking. He locked the door." Julian Brantley stood up. "I object. This is slander against the dead." "Sit down," Holloway barked. "Let her speak." Clara did not look at Julian. She looked at the judge. "He was strong. I fought him. I scratched his face. I begged him. He did what he wanted. And when he was done, he told me if I spoke of it, he would have me whipped for stealing his affection." The courtroom was deadly quiet. The women had stopped fanning themselves. 2 months later, "I knew I was with child," Clara continued, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "I went to the colonel. I went to Silas Brantley. I knelt at his feet and told him what his son had done. I asked for help. I asked for mercy." She paused, looking directly at Thaddeus Moore. "And do you know what he said? He laughed. He said, 'A Brantley stallion does not sire colts on a mule.' He said the child was a bastard, a product of my own loose morals. He threw me out of the house. He told me to get rid of it, or leave." "Lies!" Moore shouted. "It is not a lie." Clara's voice rose, ringing off the rafters. "He abandoned the child. He denied his own blood because it was inconvenient. But then Samuel died. He burned in that barn because he was too drunk to wake up. And suddenly, the colonel had no heir. Suddenly, the mule colt was the only thing left to hold the land trust." She turned to the crowd. "They don't want my son. They want the paper he represents. They abandoned him in the womb. I saved him. I ran into the snow to save him from men who only wanted a pawn, not a boy." She pointed at Buck, who was sitting wide-eyed at the table. "That boy is happy. He is kind. He knows what love is because Elias McCrae showed him. You give him to them, and you are giving a lamb to the wolves." Clara stopped. She was shaking violently now. She felt exposed, raw, as if she had flayed herself alive. Moore stepped forward, a sneer on his face. A moving story from an admitted thief and a woman of low character. You admit you stole the child. You admit you have no husband. You are living in sin with this man, are you not? She is my wife, Elias roared. Do you have a certificate? Moore shot back. No, you are a concubine, madam, and your word is worth nothing against the reputation of Colonel Brantley. My word is worth something, a voice boomed from the back of the room. The heavy double doors swung open. A man stood there, shaking the dust from a long canvas duster. He was tall, with a mustache that drooped past his chin and a silver star pinned to his chest. Marshal Grant, Judge Holloway said, sitting up straighter. Jedediah Grant walked down the aisle, his spurs jingling. He walked straight to the defendant's table and nodded to Elias. Sergeant McCrae, Marshal. Elias nodded back. Grant turned to the judge. I received a letter from Elias McCrae. He made some claims about the Brantley family. I did some checking by telegraph before I rode over. He pulled a telegram from his pocket. Seems the colonel has been trying to break a land trust for 5 years. The terms of his father's will state the land stays intact, only as long as there is a direct male heir living on the property. If there isn't one, the land gets auctioned off. The colonel is bankrupt. Judge, he owes every bank in Topeka. He needs the boy to stop the foreclosure. Grant handed the telegram to the judge. This ain't a custody case. Your Honor, it is a bank robbery using a child as the gun. The courtroom erupted. Julian Brantley looked like he was going to be sick. Moore was frantically gathering his papers. Judge Holloway read the telegram. He read it slowly. Then he looked at Moore. Is this true, Counselor? Is the estate insolvent? I am not privy to the colonel's private finances, Moore stammered. It speaks to motive, Holloway said. He looked at Clara. He looked at her with a new expression, not pity, but respect. Then he looked at Elias, leaning heavily on the table, his bandage stained with fresh blood. The law is clear on abandonment, Holloway said, his voice cutting through the noise. If a father or his family denies a child, casts them out, and offers no support, they forfeit their rights. You cannot throw a seed in the ditch and then claim the tree when it bears fruit. Holloway picked up his gavel. The petition of the Brantley estate is denied with prejudice. Furthermore, based on the testimony of abandonment and the evidence of the last 7 years, this court finds that the child known as Buck has been solely supported and raised by Elias McCrae. The judge looked down at Elias. You stood up for him. McCrae, you took a bullet for him. In this territory, that counts for more than blood. Holloway slammed the gavel down. It sounded like a gunshot, but this time, no one fell. Custody is awarded to Elias McCrae. Case closed. The room exploded into noise. Half the town cheered. The other half stood in stunned silence. Elias felt his legs give out. He slumped into the chair, burying his face in his hands. He felt Clara's arms around him, holding him up. He felt Buck pressing against his leg. We won, Clara whispered into his ear, her tears wetting his collar. Elias, we won! Julian Brantley stormed out of the courtroom, his lawyers trailing behind him like whipped dogs. He stopped at the door and looked back at Elias. There was no fire in his eyes now, only the cold, dead look of a man who had lost his leverage. Marshal Grant walked over to the table. He extended a hand to Elias. You look like hell, Elias. Feel like it, Jed, Elias said, shaking his hand. I owe you. You owe me nothing. You saved my scalp at Shiloh. We are square. Grant looked at Clara. He tipped his hat. Ma'am, that took courage. More than I have seen in most men. Clara nodded, wiping her eyes. She stood tall, ignoring the stares of the townspeople. She wasn't the fallen woman anymore. She was the mother who had fought the world and won. They walked out of the courthouse together. Elias leaned heavily on Clara, his arm over her shoulder. Buck walked in front of them, his head high. The sun was high in the sky, burning off the last of the mud. The air tasted sweet. Let's go home, Elias said. Yes, Clara said. Let's go home. But as they climbed into the wagon, Elias looked back at the retreating dust of the Brantley carriage. He knew it wasn't over. Men like that didn't forgive public humiliation. They didn't forgive the loss of a fortune. They will come back, Elias said quietly. I know, Clara said, picking up the reins. But next time, we won't be hiding. She clicked her tongue, and the wagon lurched forward, rolling out of the town that had scorned them and back toward the valley that had saved them. They had the law on their side now. They had the truth. But in the West, the only thing that truly held ground was the will to hold it. And as Elias looked at the woman driving his wagon and the boy sitting beside her, he knew his will was iron. Clara stepped through the heavy oak doors of the courthouse and stopped. The sunlight hit her face like a physical weight, warm and blinding. For a moment, she instinctively raised a hand to shield her eyes, a habit born of 7 years of looking over her shoulder, of hiding in shadows, of fearing that being seen was the same thing as being hunted. But then she lowered her hand. She stood at the top of the courthouse steps, the wind catching the hem of her faded calico dress. She looked out at the dusty street of Laramie, at the horses tied to the hitching rails, at the people who had paused in their daily business to watch the drama unfold. She did not look down. She did not hunch her shoulders. She lifted her chin, exposing the line of her throat to the world, and took a deep breath of air that tasted of dust and victory. Elias stood beside her. He was leaning heavily on a cane the marshal had lent him, his face gray with pain, but he stood as tall as a mountain pine. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at her. You all right? He asked, his voice a low rumble. I am, Clara said. She turned to look at him, and for the first time, the haunted look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a fierce, terrifying clarity. I am breathing, Elias, I am actually breathing. Behind them, the doors swung open again. Julian Brantley emerged, followed by Thaddeus Moore and their retinue. The defeat sat on them like a stain. Julian's face was twisted in a mask of petulant fury. He stopped when he saw them, his hand twitching toward a hip that held no gun, as he had been disarmed by the bailiff. This isn't over, McCrae! Julian spat, his voice carrying over the noise of the street. You think a piece of paper from a backwater judge changes anything? That boy is Brantley blood. You can't wash that out. Elias shifted his weight, wincing slightly, and turned to face the man. Blood doesn't make a father, Julian, and paper doesn't make a man. You go back to Kansas. You tell your colonel that the bank can have his land, but he can't have my son. Julian sneered, stepping closer, though his lawyers held him back. You watch your back, cowboy. Accidents happen in this country. Barns burn. People disappear. We have a long memory. Elias's hand tightened on the head of his cane until his knuckles turned white. If I see you, or any man of yours, within 100 miles of my family again, there won't be a trial. There will just be a funeral. The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Julian stared at Elias, and in the cowboy's cold, flat gaze, he saw something that money couldn't buy and lawyers couldn't argue away. He saw a man who had already died once for that boy and was perfectly willing to do it again. Julian spun on his heel, shoving past his own men, and marched toward his carriage. Clara watched them go. She watched the carriage rattle down the street, kicking up a cloud of dust that slowly settled back onto the earth. He means it, Elias said softly. They won't stop hating us. We may never be safe. Clara, not truly. They will always be out there, waiting for a slip. Clara reached out and took his hand, interlacing her fingers with his scarred ones. She looked at the retreating dust, then down at Buck, who was holding onto her skirt with both hands, looking up at them with wide, adoring eyes. We never were safe. Elias, she said, her voice steady as the turning earth. From the moment I walked into the snow, we were walking on ice, but now we are free, and I would rather be in danger and free than safe and in chains. Elias looked at her, and a slow smile broke through the pain on his face. Free. He tested the word. I reckon I like the sound of that. They did not go back to the shack to live. They went back to burn it. It was Elias's idea, but Clara was the one who struck the match. They moved everything of value out first, the iron stove, The bed frame, the books, the tools. They loaded the wagon until the axles groaned. The shack stood empty, a hollow shell of logs and mud. It was the place where Elias had healed her. It was the place where they had survived the starving winter. But it was also the place where she had hidden like a criminal, where she had flinched at every sound, where the ghosts of her rape and her shame had lived in the corners like spiders. "Are you sure about this?" Elias asked. He was sitting on the wagon seat, Buck beside him. Clara stood by the door, holding a torch of pitch-soaked pine. "It is a cage," she said. "We don't live in cages anymore." She threw the torch inside. The dry timber, seasoned by 7 years of wind and sun, caught instantly. The fire roared to life, licking up the walls, devouring the roof. Clara stepped back, the heat flushing her face. She watched the flames consume the past. She watched the smoke rise in a black column, carrying away the fear, the secrets, and the lies. They drove away without looking back, heading not for the river bottom, but up. Elias knew a place. He had found it years ago, before Clara, when he was just a solitary man riding the high country. It was a hanging valley, 2,000 feet above the basin, nestled in the shoulder of the mountains. It had sweet water, thick grass, and a stand of aspen trees that turned to gold in the autumn. It was hard to get to. It was defensible. It was beautiful. They built a new cabin there. It took all summer and well into the autumn. Elias worked despite his healing wound, driven by a manic need to create a sanctuary. Clara worked beside him, peeling logs, mixing mud for chinking, hauling stone for the chimney. Buck worked too, carrying water and gathering kindling, proud to be building our house. This cabin was different. It had 3 rooms. It had windows that faced south to catch the sun. It had a porch wide enough for 3 rocking chairs. It wasn't a hiding place. It was a homestead. By the time the first snow fell, dusting the pines and sugar, they were inside. The fire in the new hearth cracked and popped, smelling of pine resin. One evening, after supper, they sat in the main room. Elias was mending a bridle. Clara was knitting. Buck sat on the rug between them, drawing on a piece of slate. Clara looked up from her needles. She looked at the solid walls. She looked at the man whose hair was turning white at the temples. She looked at the boy whose profile was becoming more sharp, more defined every day. "We are here," she whispered, almost to herself. Elias looked up. "What is that?" "We are here," she repeated, louder. "No lies, no running, just us." Elias put down the bridle. He looked at Buck, then at Clara. "Yeah, just us, a family." "A chosen family," Clara corrected. "The best kind," Elias said. The winter that followed was nothing like the first one. There was plenty of food. There was no fear of the door opening, but there was a new hunger growing between them. The trial had stripped them bare, but it had also broken the dam. The intimacy they had shared before had always been shadowed by the secret of Buck's parentage. Now, the light reached everywhere. One afternoon in late March, the sun was warm enough to melt the icicles on the eaves. Elias was out by the woodpile. He had taken off his shirt, the heat of his labor keeping him warm despite the chill air. He was swinging the splitting maul, a rhythmic, powerful motion that made the muscles in his back ripple under the scars. Clara was beating a rug on the porch. She stopped, the rug forgotten in her hands. She watched him. She watched the way the sweat gleamed on his skin. She watched the way his body moved, not with the frantic energy of survival, but with the assured power of a man who owns the ground he stands on. She saw the puckered pink scar on his side where the bullet had gone through, a permanent mark of his devotion. She felt a heat rise in her own body that had nothing to do with the sun. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't safe. It was pure, unadulterated desire. Elias paused, resting the head of the axe on the chopping block. He wiped his forehead with his arm and looked up. He caught her staring. He didn't look away. He didn't make a joke. He stood there, chest heaving, and held her gaze with an intensity that made her knees weak. He looked at her not as a mother, not as a victim, but as a woman. That night, after Buck was asleep in his own room, Clara came to bed. Elias was already there, lying on his back, watching the firelight dance on the ceiling. Clara didn't blow out the lamp. She stood by the side of the bed and unbuttoned her nightdress. She let it fall to the floor. She saw Elias's eyes widen, saw the way his breath hitched. She wanted him to see her. She wanted him to see the stretch marks on her belly, the softness of her hips, the scars on her own skin. She climbed into the bed, straddling him. "Clara," he whispered, reaching up to touch her face. "Don't talk," she said softly. She began to undress him. She pulled the blankets down. She ran her hands over his chest, tracing the old war wounds, the bite of the winter, the scar of the bullet. She kissed the jagged line on his side. When they made love. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't a desperate attempt to forget the world outside. It was a conversation. It was slow, deep, and terrifyingly open. There were no shadows to hide in. Elias moved with a reverence that made her weep. He kissed her mouth, her throat, her breasts, worshipping the life that beat within her. Clara met him with a fierceness that surprised them both. She anchored him. She demanded him. She took him into herself as if she could rewrite his history with her own body. "I love you." He groaned against her neck, his voice ragged. "I know," she whispered back, her nails digging into his shoulders. "I know." They lay together afterward, tangled in the sheets, the sweat drying on their skin. The silence was absolute, but it wasn't empty. It was full of peace. Elias shifted, propping himself up on one elbow. He looked down at her, brushing a strand of damp hair from her forehead. "Clara," he said. We should get married." Clara opened her eyes. She smiled lazily. "We are married. Elias, in every way that counts." "I know," he said. "But I want to do it right, not for the law. The law can go to hell for all I care, and not for the neighbors." "Then why?" "For Buck," Elias said. "I want him to see it. I want him to stand there and watch me promise to love you until I die. I want him to know that love isn't something you steal or hide. I want him to know it is something you say out loud in the daylight. I want him to know it lasts." Clara felt the tears prick her eyes again. She reached up and cupped his face, her thumb tracing the line of his beard. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, let's show him." They were married 3 weeks later. In the high meadow above the cabin, there was no preacher. The circuit rider wouldn't be through until July, and Elias didn't want to wait. There were no guests. The town of Laramie was a world away. They stood beneath a massive ponderosa pine that had stood watch over the valley for 200 years. Elias wore his black suit, brushed and mended. Clara wore a dress she had made herself, dyed the color of the wild bluebells that grew along the creek. Buck stood between them. He was 8 years old, solemn and scrubbed clean, holding the rings Elias had hammered out of a silver dollar. "Do you, Elias?" Clara said, her voice clear and strong. "Take me, Clara, to be your wife, to hold the land with me, to raise the boy with me, to be my shelter and my storm?" "I do," Elias said. He took her hands. "And do you, Clara, take me, Elias, to be your husband, to trust me with your heart, to walk the ridge with me, even when the snow is deep?" "I do." Elias knelt down then, bringing himself to Buck's eye level. "And do you, Buck," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion, "take us to be your ma and PA? Do you promise to let us love you, no matter what the world says? Do you promise to be a McCrae?" Buck's chin quivered. He threw his arms around Elias's neck, burying his face in the rough wool of the coat. "I do, Pa, I do." Elias stood up, lifting the boy with him, and Clara wrapped her arms around both of them. The wind sang through the pine needles, a choir of the earth, and the sun blessed them. It was enough. It was everything. Time in the mountains does not move in straight lines. It moves in circles, seasons turning, snow falling and melting, grass growing and dying. Years passed. The saplings Clara planted grew into trees. The horses grew old and were replaced by their foals. The hair on Elias's head turned the color of the winter drifts, and Clara's face gained the map of a life lived fully, etched with laugh lines and sun. They had no more children. The winter of '68 had taken that from Clara, the cold damaging her in ways that didn't show. But it didn't matter. They had Buck. Buck grew strong. He grew tall, with shoulders like a beam and hands that could gentle a wild mustang or sketch the delicate wing of a hawk. He never went to Kansas. He never asked about the Brantleys. He knew who his father was. Elias died in his sleep in the winter of 1889, 20 years after he found a woman in the snow. His heart simply stopped, worn out by a life of hard use and deep love. Clara followed him 2 days later. She didn't sicken. She simply faded. She sat in a rocking chair by the fire, looked at the empty chair beside her, closed her eyes, and stepped across the divide to be with him. She couldn't bear to be in a world where he wasn't. Buck buried them side by side on the ridge, overlooking the valley they had built. The year was 1905. A lone rider crested the ridge. The horse was a fine bay stallion, strong and proud. The man in the saddle was in his late 30s, wearing a sheepskin coat and a flat-brimmed hat. He had dark eyes that held a solemn intelligence. Buck McCrae pulled his horse to a halt. The valley below was golden in the autumn light. A herd of cattle grazed in the bottomland. Smoke rose from the chimney of the sturdy cabin, where his own wife and 2 sons were waiting for him. It was a good life, a life built on iron and love. Buck dismounted and walked to the 2 stone markers beneath the ponderosa pine. The names were weathered but legible. Elias McCrae, beloved husband, father. Clara McCrae, beloved wife, mother. Buck stood there for a long time, listening to the wind in the branches. He took his hat off, the wind ruffling his dark hair. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small object. It was a toy horse, carved from pine. It was old, the wood smoothed by the touch of small hands, one leg glued back on with resin. It was the first thing Elias had ever made for him. Buck knelt and placed the wooden horse on the ground, right between the 2 headstones, bridging the gap of earth between them. He touched the cold stone of Elias's grave, then Clara's. "They said I didn't belong to you," Buck whispered, his voice husky. "They said I was stolen. They said I was a liar." He looked out at the valley, at the legacy they had fought, bled, and died to give him. "But they were wrong," he said to the wind and the ghosts of the people who had saved him. "You were always mine, both of you." He stood up, put his hat back on, and mounted his horse. He turned the animal toward the home fire burning in the valley below, leaving the dead to their rest, finally and eternally at peace. Author's note: thank you for riding this trail with me. It has been a long journey from that frozen ravine in Part 1 to the high meadow in Part 6. This story of Elias, Clara, and little Buck is a testament to the idea that family isn't just blood. It's who you bleed for and who you stand beside when the storm comes. I would love to hear your thoughts on their journey. Did the ending bring you the peace these characters deserved? Where are you listening or reading from today? Please leave a comment below in English. And if you enjoyed this tale of grit and redemption, consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories from the frontier. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.